One really is good. This includes comments of a personal nature directed at other speakers. And since there was no other speakers in the room, I was going to read that one for you. Anyway, we got rules, and we'll follow them. First bill to come before the Senate Minerals Committee is House Bill 81. It's a continuation from last week when we didn't have enough time to get to it. We're at the point of taking public comment. Any public comment on House Bill 81? Go ahead when you're ready.
Good afternoon. I think it is afternoon officially. Jeremiah Bishop, State Banking Commissioner and head of the Division of Banking. I think I am the Commissioner for the Mortgage Act, which this is a part of. I just wanted to do a few things. One, outline a few things that this bill does and more importantly doesn't do. A few areas that I think might clarify some confusion based off of some other comments I've heard. And then a proposed amendment at the end in case this committee decides to move forward with this bill. So my understanding of this bill is it exempts companies from obtaining a mortgage lender license from our office as long as they make less than 5 loans per year and they're not compensated. They can collect interest on that loan, but they can't be compensated in any other way. So our mortgage licensing system, it's kind of complicated, as all mortgage lending is. You have a mortgage lender license, which is what this bill addresses. That's usually the sponsoring entity, and then they might license branches. And then you have licensed mortgage loan originators. Those are the individual loan officers working for the licensed entity that are working with the borrowers and presenting loan terms. This bill, I think it originally addressed the loan originators. There was an amendment on the other side that passed, and now it's the companies. And I'll come back to that and why that's important in several different areas, because just because a company is exempt, the MLO might still be licensed. We have similar exemptions where as long as they're not being compensated, they might be exempt for a license. But just because the company is not receiving any fees, and they're not compensated, if their employee is receiving a salary at all, that's compensation and they have to be licensed with us as a MLO that is then sponsored by, in this case, an exempt mortgage lender. This will be, I think, important because we examine both. We license both and they renewed on an annual basis. And I think part of the questions I have is how do you determine what compensation is? For those MLOs, I think it's pretty clear in the case of an entity. They're just not receiving the fees that are generally tied to a mortgage loan, but they're keeping the interest. I think that's fairly clear. Those MLOs, though, that's a case-by-case basis. They're going to have to work with us on each individual presenting these loan terms to the individual to see whether or not they should be licensed with us or not. And then my understanding of kind of where this came from, I believe it's mostly up in the Jackson market. I heard the sponsor say that I think it was maybe a nonprofit company that wanted to maybe make some loans to their employees so they could purchase homes, something like that. I don't know how this will be used. That's one of the concerns I might have with it, is this opens the door, I think, to some possibilities that may not, I think, it'll increase the risk to both the entity and to borrowers. But in that case, if you have an entity who qualifies as an exemption under this bill, and they want to purchase a home and then make a loan to their employee to live in that home, they may not even need a mortgage license currently. It depends on the structure of that transaction. Our Mortgage Act, which this is a part of, only licenses first mortgages. In Wyoming, our law is a little bit different than most states. If you have a second mortgage, that's a completely different section of law. That's our UCCC consumer lending license. So if you're doing anything with a secondary mortgage, it doesn't apply. So in the case where you have an entity who gives a loan to their employees, they could either purchase the property, the company could purchase the property outright with cash, they're the sole owner, in which case it's a traditional loan to that employee. That's a mortgage loan that falls under this act. If they take out a loan to purchase that, and then that property, and then give that a second loan to their employee, that's a second mortgage. That doesn't fall under this act. That's possibly a consumer lender license. It depends on a lot of different factors. Or they could purchase the property and then just do a contract for deed to the employee. That also doesn't apply to a mortgage act. So each individual company using this, they're going to have to come talk to us either way to figure out whether or not they even need this license or not, whether they qualify for this exemption, or it's a case-by-case basis. Every loan they make, they're going to have to call us. And then I also wanted to go through some of the factors that we look at for determining whether to grant a license to a mortgage company, because again, this law only exempts them from state licensing. They don't have to be licensed with us. They don't have to be examined by us, which is about every 5 years, but they still have to follow pretty much every single mortgage law there is, because those are all federal laws. Anybody conducting mortgage lending must comply with a multitude of federal laws. There's a lot of them. This is a heavily regulated industry, and you must be an expert to do this. The big one is Reg Z, Truth in Lending. There's multiple other ones depending on the situation. They still have to follow all those. We're just not examining them to making sure they're following them. So all this bill is doing is saying you don't have to do the license with us. There's an annual renewal, and we don't examine you unless we receive a complaint. You still have to follow every single federal law. We're just not going in every 5 years to make sure you're complying. So some of the factors that we evaluate whether to grant a license for a mortgage company, it's not that long of a process. It's things like the background of the people involved, making sure they've never been convicted of a felony, that their application is accurate. Generally, I think by the time we receive an official application, we have a mandate of 60 days to take an action on that license. I checked with our licensing staff. Right now, we're about 2 weeks out. Once we get an application, we can process it within 2 weeks. And then it's just an annual renewal. I think it's a $500 fee every year. So that's really all this bill is doing, is exempting them from that process. Now, if we receive a complaint from a consumer getting a loan from one of these entities, we can then go in to the company and see if they violated law. Now, going back to the MLO issue, we might still go in and look at the MLO because they would have to be licensed with us in most cases. Next, I just kind of want to throw out a hypothetical.
Question here.
Why would they need the MLO if they were acting, in this case, as the mortgage loan licensor? Or, lender, mortgage lender. Would they have to have a separate MLO? I don't see why that would follow.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Senator your office. So this bill would exempt the mortgage lender, that's the entity.
Right.
Under a separate section of our law, there's the mortgage loan originator. That's an individual always. That's usually the loan officer sitting down at the table going over those loan terms. If that individual's getting compensated at all to conduct that activity, meaning if they're even receiving a paycheck at all, it might be related to other business, but they're getting compensated from that mortgage lender, they have to be licensed with us. The company sponsoring them will not be licensed, but the individuals presenting loan terms will, again, most likely have to be licensed with us unless they meet an exemption elsewhere in the law. And that goes back to what I kind of was saying about the reviewing what is compensation. That's much harder for these MLOs to get by. So they would still have to be licensed. They still have to be sponsored by the exempt company and have an NMLS number. That's why this is very complicated. I think people are still going to have to talk to us on a case-by-case basis to determine where they fit with this, what licensing they need, whether it's the company or the individual MLO level.
Mr. Chairman, this certainly doesn't instruct anyone of that. They wouldn't necessarily come if they felt that they met the mortgage lender exemption here. I don't think they would then call you up. So I guess that's a potential concern, and I don't know whether they would have, under the envisioned scenario, whether they would have an originator. So I guess we can look to Leader Yin on that one to see what the scenario is. But Please continue, go. I know you had more comments, so I appreciate you answering that question I just had.
Go ahead,
Yep,
Chairman.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. Another potential area that I think this could be possibly abused, our current exemptions do not provide an exemption based on loan volume. It's things like if you're a law office, or if you're making a loan to someone you know individually, things like that. If you make an exemption based off of loan volume, where I live in Wyoming, it's very easy to go form an LLC, and that LLC can make 5 loans and be exempt. Then they can go form another LLC, make 5 loans, and basically have any number of entities all making 5 loans or less, and so they're never licensed or examined by our office until we receive a complaint. Another potential area where I think it increases the risk both to consumers and the entities is if you're a consumer getting a loan from one of these exempt entities, most likely this is not a professional mortgage lender. Again, this is an incredibly complex process. I'm sure a lot of us have signed mortgages. It's not a simple paper that you sign, and that's for a reason. So if you're getting a loan from one of these exempt entities, it's most likely not their primary business. But also, I think it could significantly increase the risk to that entity because most mortgages are sold on the secondary market almost immediately. In order to do that, in most cases, there are certain qualifications that must be met in order for them to be really marketable to the major buyers in this space. In this case, I think it would be difficult to call these mortgages traditional mortgages that are easily sold. So I think it's very likely that the entity that's exempt would likely have to hold these loans on their books for the duration of the loan. That's up to 30 years most of the time. That increases the risk because if those default, they're the ones on the hook for that loss, unless they can sell it to somebody else. And again, that even goes back to the original comment or concern I had with what's the structure of the individual loan? Is it a secondary loan? Is it a deed for contract? What's that look like?
What would they have to do to sell that into the secondary market? Go through some process of yours or something, or what?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So that is loan servicing is one area. Most states other than Wyoming license and regulate mortgage loan servicing companies because you have one servicer that services that loan even though the owner might be somewhere, a different entity. Most of the time when you make a mortgage, that's why your lender changes. I think it's 3 to 5 times in that first year because it jumps from bank to bank to bank. Most of them lend up in a securitized mortgage-backed security held by a government entity, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, things like that. That's where most mortgages end up. If it is not a qualified mortgage, and that is defined under federal law, those entities cannot buy these secondary loans unless they meet strict requirements. Now, these exempt entities could definitely make a loan that meets those requirements. They're allowed to. They can definitely do it. If they, basically to answer the question, they'd have to find someone willing to buy it. Now, there are rules, like I said, there are set rules for what is a qualified mortgage that these entities wouldn't have to comply with, but if they want to sell them on the secondary market, they most likely would have to comply with those as well. The other area that they would definitely have to comply with is ability to repay analysis. Almost every loan secured by a dwelling must comply with the ability to repay requirements of Reg Z, whether or not you're licensed at the state level or not. So you must determine whether or not the debt to income ratio of that borrower is sufficient to make those payments. This is very defined well-defined in federal law, what you have to comply with to even make this loan to begin with, regardless of what the state structure is. So hopefully that answered your question, Mr. Chairman.
Another question, Senator Jones.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Bishop, I'm trying to run this through my head. It seems like we've had a recurring theme this year of watering down licenses. And that's what I look at this as, is that we're just watering this license down because it sounds like some of the options you gave earlier in your testimony would be a much, much better option than for us to pass this bill.
Go ahead.
Yep, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Bishop.
Senator Jones, make sure I understand what the question was, understanding if this is kind of watering down our licensing requirements, what exactly it does. I think that just depends on who uses it. if you make less than 5 loans and you're not compensated, you're exempt from licensing. You're not exempt from following federal law. Which brings me actually to another point. In that instance, if we do not examine the company, typically if there are issues, they would be enforced or examined by the CFPB at the federal level, Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. That's a little tricky at the current moment because that agency is a federal agency, is currently not doing anything. Here about 2 weeks ago, they were all sent home and instructed to not do any work. So that's putting all of that enforcement work onto the states. In this case, we don't know, if you're exempt, we may not know who you are or what activity you're doing. Hopefully we do, because most likely your MLOs are licensed, but it's not clear.
Other questions for Mr. Bishop?
I had one more, just
Oh, okay.
potential amendment, if I may. This
ahead.
kind of addresses one of the earlier questions. If this committee decides that they want to move forward with this bill, I would suggest an amendment. I think it's on page 2, line 5. I would recommend either this, inserting this language or similar language, saying any person using this exemption must notify the commissioner prior to issuing any loans and must annually report to the commissioner how many loans were made during the prior year.
Do you have that written out?
I have it, I can send it to someone very quickly.
Can
if I
you,
have.
can you give it to Sue?
Absolutely.
So we have that
Yep,
down?
absolutely. I can email it if that works. Some of the reasons I'm asking for this is, again, we need to know who these MLOs are. Well, in order to do that, we need to know who the entity is. And for them to sponsor an MLO, they need to be registered in NMLS. That's a nationwide registry for all mortgage lenders. You must have an NMLS number to be a sponsor, whether you're exempt or not at the state level, so that then you can sponsor MLOs on the individual basis licensed through us. Second, we kind of want to know who these companies are and where they're doing business. In case we do get a complaint from a consumer, we know where to go. Secondly, if I get a license exemption request, basically, from one of these entities, we're going to put our staff, hey, keep an eye out for the mortgage loan originator, those MLO licenses, because most likely they're going to need it. If not, they at least should be asking us whether or not that license is required or not. Honestly, I think any company using this exemption should notify us to make sure that they even need a mortgage license, because again, if it's a secondary mortgage, they don't need a license anyways. They might need a consumer lender license, which this bill doesn't address. So something in there saying, please notify the commissioner before you do anything. We're happy to work with them, make sure that they have the license that they need, their MLOs are licensed as needed, and then if we do get a complaint, we know who to go to. But yeah, I'll definitely, that would be my recommendation if this committee decides to move this bill. I think that'd be my recommended amendment. I think that would kind of go with, I think, Senator Rothfuss's question of how would they know the MLOs should be licensed?
Okay,
And with that, I'd like to stand for any
and
questions.
you'll send that to Sue,
Yes,
please? So we have the verbiage like we want it.
yes.
Okay, other questions for Mr. Bishop? Other questions for Mr. Bishop? Hearing none, thank you, Mr. Bishop. And I think the originator of the bill is here.
Yes.
Maybe he wants to say something about this before I close comments.
That would be great.
Mr.
Go ahead.
Chairman. Mr. Chairman, thank you. So members, I apologize for being late. We were on third reading votes and I actually bailed on our last third reading vote to come down here. Members, so this bill came before you because of a request from a constituent. So we have many employers in Teton County that want to ensure that their employees have housing. Some of them own properties and they rent out their owned properties to their employees. But one of the employers reached out to me saying that they wanted to actually help finance a mortgage for their employee, so their employee would have stable housing for the long term, with the intent and knowledge that, there is risk involved with issuing a mortgage to their employee. But they understand that a traditional mortgage may be very expensive for their employee, but they wanted to take that risk because they wanted the stability for that employee. And so that's why you have the language in front of you. It is a green copy because I actually put it in the MLO portion when the intent actually wasn't to put it in the MLO portion, it was to put it in the lender portion. I think with regards to the commissioner's comments, I don't think an MLO is strictly necessary because that requirement would be for a lender who is licensed, and without that licensing, it may not be necessary. But it's still, they still fully have to be compliant with the Fair Housing Act, any other federal laws when they issue a mortgage. I'm sure that these are types of mortgage that would not be able to be sold on the secondary market, but I also don't think that's the intent of the employer to bring forth that. And that's why you have the limitation, right? It's not to be in business of giving these mortgages out. And also, the type of abuse posited is not really possible. One, because the exemption requires no compensation or gain. So at most, they could charge interest. But trying to do it with with several LLCs would also be quite hard because then you'd have to advertise as one business and then sell the mortgage under another business. I think the abuse, the likelihood of fraud would be very low. But I do agree with the commissioner's notification requirement. I think that's totally reasonable and a good consumer protection for the bill. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
I have two questions, Representative Yin. One is 5 too limiting for your employer to furnish housing for his employees? And he does understand that he probably won't be able to resell these mortgages on the open market, so he's stuck with them for quite some time, probably.
Yeah, so I worked with the constituents to come up with the language in the bill. I think 5 is plenty. I think they don't necessarily need 5 because it's going to be on a real case-by-case basis. If an employee is able to get housing that they could even finance a mortgage for, it's not going to be a common occurrence. So if the committee's will is to even shrink that number, I think that would be okay. I think they might be on Zoom, may or may not be, but they would also be able to answer that
Nobody's
question.
on Zoom.
Nobody's on Zoom? Okay, so then, if I get comments about that, and you guys have the will to change it, I'm happy to pass those on.
I wasn't going to change it. I was just hoping that it was enough.
It is sufficient.
Enough for you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, other questions for Representative Yin? Other questions? Hearing none? Thank you, Representative Yin, for coming and talking to us. Thank you very much. Any other public comment on House Bill 81? Any other public comment? Any other public? No? Hearing none, we'll close public comment. Committee, what's your pleasure? Moved by Rothfuss. Seconded by Anderson. Any discussion? Any discussion? Yes,
I'd move the amendment for the reporting requirement.
and I don't have that amendment, but Sue will have that amendment.
Yeah, exactly, whatever,
It's exactly what the banker is saying,
yep, correct.
what we want to put in.
That's my motion.
Right on line 5, right after the period there on
Yep.
provided, is where we want to put that in. Oh, and we have it right now. Oh, wonderful.
There we go.
Thank you.
That's the amendment.
That's the amendment. Any discussion on the amendment? Any discussion on the amendment? All in favor of the amendment, say aye. Aye. All opposed, same sign. That amendment carries. Back on the bill. Yes,
Yeah,
Senator Rothfuss.
just briefly, I think this is reasonable with the reporting requirement. I think we need to hear back from the Division of Banking to see if there are any problems. If any of the concerns come up, we can tweak it, but there's no reason that we have to have the high-level requirements for a situation like this where they're trying to keep the loan internal. It's very appropriate that we have massive consumer protection for mortgage lenders and originators. But this is just trying to make sure that nobody's breaking the law for having an in-house approach. And I think that's a reasonable compromise. So, makes sense to me.
Other discussion, other discussion, other discussion on the bill? If not, we'll do a roll call on the, Jones, go ahead. Senator Jones.
I'm just still trying to figure out why we need this when there's other options for that employer to do. We could do contract for deed, he could be a co-signer, like there's other options without doing this. So I'm just trying to figure out why we wouldn't just stay the course instead of muddying the waters a little bit.
Okay. Other discussion? Other discussion? Hearing none, we're gonna do a roll call vote on this baby. Sue, you ready to do a roll call vote on House Bill 81?
Mr. Chairman,
Please.
this is a roll call vote for House Bill 81 engrossed as amended. Senator Cooper?
No.
Senator Jones? No. Senator Nethercott?
Excused.
Senator Rothfuss?
Aye.
Chairman Anderson?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, you have 2 ayes, 2 noes, and 1 excused.
I'm afraid that fails then, doesn't it? That, House Bill 81 has failed. The Minerals Committee, Senate Minerals Committee. Thank you. And the next bill before us is House Bill 160. And maybe we have somebody to talk to us?
Will you text me when he's up?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Chairman and Senators, I'm here to present 160 for you if you want me to.
You're gonna what?
Present 160 for you, House Bill 160.
Yeah, that's
for
what
you.
I want you to do.
All right,
Trevor.
let's do it.
Yeah.
This is a pretty long bill, so I'll try to be quick. It's basically repealing 22-1-102A, triple XIX, B, VII, which is photo identification issued by University of Wyoming, a Wyoming community college, or a Wyoming public school. It just repeals that, so you can't use those IDs to vote. You have to have your Wyoming ID. That's all this is doing, is repealing the University of Wyoming's, Wyoming community colleges, or any Wyoming public school identification as a form of identification to vote. You cannot use those. We're repealing that.
Okay, questions? Yes, Senator Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Representative Tarver, why?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cooper, for the main reason is student IDs. You can be not a citizen of America and still have a university ID if you're coming over here on a visa or whatever. So it just closes that little loophole.
Follow up, Mr. Senator Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How many voter fraud issues have we had using this exact tool in the last 10 years, 20 years? Do you know?
Do you have
Sure.
any numbers on that?
Chairman, I have no idea, but I will bet there might be someone in this room that could answer that, but I cannot answer that question.
I doubt there's anybody in the room who can answer it. Yes, Senator Rothfuss. Sure.
So this isn't the part of statute, though, that's for registration. This is the part of statutes that's for identification when you're going to the poll after you've already registered. The registration requires proof of citizenship. The polling requires a diversity of identifications, which would even include a concealed carry permit, for example. So I don't understand why you need to remove this as an individual identification at the poll. I do understand why you wouldn't want it. It's not a real ID. I understand why you wouldn't want it at the time of registration. So I'll just ask then Senator Cooper's question again, why?
Go ahead.
Mr.
Representative
Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, I'll have to, I guess, use the same, I'm assuming fraud, simplicity, and basically just narrowing it down to requiring a Wyoming ID to vote is really, I think we're just trying to get it very simple to eliminate as much fraud as possible.
Mr. Chairman,
Oh, yep, go ahead.
following up though, if that were the motivation, I'm not understanding. You've got two Medicaid insurance card types that allow you eligibility. I wouldn't even know what one of those looked like. If I was a poll watcher and somebody presented me with a Medicaid card or Medicare card, I'd just say, sure. I guess it's Medicare and Medicaid card. I wouldn't know the difference. And then a valid permit issued by the state of Wyoming to carry a concealed firearm. Once again, I don't think you have to have lived in the state for a long time to have one of those, and they don't reissue on an annual or even frequent basis. So my concealed carry permit could be like 11 years old, and I could live in Texas. I guess I'm not understanding why the enhanced scrutiny around photo identification issued by the University of Wyoming, a Wyoming community college, or a Wyoming public school, those even have a year on them. So I don't see how this is causing fraud.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, you know what, I'm gonna have to phone a friend if you want to get down into the nitty gritty of this, and I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, thank you.
I can answer a couple of those. Your concealed carry permit doesn't last 11 years. I can attest to that. And your Medicare card does not have a picture on it, so you couldn't use it.
You can.
It has to have a picture.
No. Mr. Chairman.
Really?
This is not for this is for purposes of voter identification at the poll, and it doesn't have a picture, and it doesn't need to have a picture. That was part of the compromise that got this passed, was that a Medicare insurance card or a Medicaid insurance card would be allowed, even though that's repealed in December 31st, 2029. So apparently that vanishes at some point in the future, but for now it is. So is it 5 years on the concealed carry permit? I can't remember what
5.
It's 5 years, okay.
That's what they tell me after 8 years. That's how you learn things like that. Senator Jones, go ahead. Sorry to keep you waiting.
That's okay. I just was going to say, it's been a while since I've been in college, but we knew where our IDs were all the time, our student IDs, and I think they do have barcodes on them now, and they're able to use them for even more things. So I do think maybe that students might have that on a day-to-day basis, whereas they might only have their driver's license if they're driving or going to a bar or something to prove their age. So I just want to make sure we're not going to keep students from voting if we pass this bill. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Jones, yeah, I do have some thoughts on it, and I told my kids if you're responsible enough to vote, you're responsible enough to get your ID and take it down there. And I think it's, uniformly, I don't think it's that difficult to have a driver's license and or an ID. And most of us have driver's license by the time we're 18. So that's my thoughts on this. It's uniformity, it's simplicity. And I think there would be a lot less chance of fraud if we stick to one identification, because who knows who the poll watchers are? Maybe they know what it is, maybe they don't. But if we have one identification, surely they can figure that out. That was my thought process.
Thank you. I can attest to the fact that there's a lot of students down there that are not citizens. My son-in-law was from Norway, and he had, 8 kids from Norway. And they had student passes, and then they got driver's license also. But I'm not sure what his driver's license said, whether it said Norway or Laramie, but he was not a citizen. And so I'm not sure what the driver's license would have done, but there's a lot of foreign students at the University of Wyoming that are not eligible to vote. Yes, go ahead.
But they can't get on the registration rolls with that ID.
Right,
So
right.
there's nothing that, they could walk in and jump up and down all day long with their UW Y01 ID, and they'll never get registered to vote with that sucker. So I just don't see that there's a problem here that this is resolving. I'm missing it.
Other questions for Representative Tarver? Other questions? Hearing none, thank you. Thank you, Tarver, for being with us today.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else like to speak on House Bill 160? voter identification revisions. Come right up and state your name and your rank and serial number and
Give me 1 second. Hello, Senators. Hello, Chairman Anderson, Senator Cooper, Senator Jones, and Senator Rothfuss. My name is Nathan Corley, and I am a freshman at the University of Wyoming. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you in front regarding House Bill 160. The bill would directly affect thousands of voters, including myself. House Bill 160 creates unnecessary barriers to students voting, and it discourages participation through this added complexity for prospective voters. When students receive their Y01 IDs, they already must present proof of government identification, photo identification, and adding this further requirement does not enhance security. It only makes it more difficult for students to exercise their right to vote. When I asked students this morning about what they thought about this bill before I drove over to Cheyenne, the overwhelming consensus, as with you guys, was why. It only makes it more difficult for these students to vote. Most of them do vote with their Y01 ID or do register, and they use it in the registration and the voting process. Sorry, not registration, just the voting process. And they were dismayed by the potential banning of this. I don't believe that this bill was made in bad faith, though. It makes sense to make our elections safer. There is compromises we can do. So I have my Y01 ID. If any of you guys would like to look at it, it has our, I'll bring it up right after. It has our W number and a couple other pieces of information stating our student, perhaps a secondary piece of information. So, you know, whether we're a citizen, if we're born here, our birth date, some other piece of information that could work as a compromise. And I'm sure the university would be open to doing that to enhance voter security. Let's see. But as it stands, this bill only makes it harder for students to represent themselves in our democracy. And I urge you to consider these concerns as well as the concerns of my fellow students. And how this will directly impact their lives and their representation. Thank you.
any questions for Nathan? Any questions for Nathan? Senator Cooper.
Thank you. Nathan, are you a citizen of the United States?
I am a citizen of the United States.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, go ahead.
Are you a citizen of the state of Wyoming?
I'm not a citizen of the state of Wyoming currently.
One more question.
Yes.
Are you registered to vote in Wyoming?
I'm not registered to vote in Wyoming. I'm currently registered to vote in Florida. But I'm hoping, I just transferred over my car registration. I'm hoping to get my Wyoming citizenship somewhere along the way.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Corley, would it be a burden to, if you had a Wyoming license and were a resident of Wyoming, would it be a burden to you to bring your driver's license to vote?
For me personally, no. I carry my driver's license around everywhere. However, as someone that encouraged, my fellow students to come out and vote during this election and to encourage a lot of people to vote, it is hard actually getting people to come out on that Tuesday, to come out of class, to, find that, you have to spend around 2 hours, to stand in that line. Find that 2 hour, 3 hour gap, especially I'm a double major currently, and it's pretty busy. And I have a lot of students that are doing the same exact thing, and they find it hard. Whether their driver's license is at home in their dorms and they have to go right from class to voting or some other logistical issue, the current thing at hand really does not provide anything. We have to have our Y01 IDs everywhere we go. So if we added that secondary, as I suggested, that secondary piece of information on there, that would add, that clarification, and they could easily just bring that, drive from their class right to the elementary school or wherever the voting is, and participate then.
Question, yeah. Jones.
Mr. Chairman, I'm wondering, is there voting available right on campus?
I believe in the past election there wasn't. We had done some registration efforts. The closest place to vote and where I went with some of my friends to vote was the elementary school. I forget the name. It's right, yes, Spring Creek Elementary School. We went to vote there. It was around a 3 hour line. It was pretty good. If we could get somewhere to vote on campus, that would be really good. I'd encourage that, and I'd love to work with people to try to make that happen.
And are you aware that you can vote like 2 weeks ahead of the vote? you can go down and vote at the courthouse?
I don't believe a lot of students are aware of that. If we could make that more available, that information would be great to students. And, you know, going into further elections and the next election cycles, we'll always make sure to share that information. But actually getting that across to students who are already so busy with their stuff and honestly don't have the same interest as you and I in politics, they probably won't care as much about that information. They'll just want to go in simply on the day when they know to vote and, you know, participate.
Yeah, yeah. Questions? Another question? Another question? Yes. Don't forget your card. You won't be able to do anything in Wyoming.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Go ahead.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, committee, for your time here today. My name is Jonathan Brown. I'm currently a center at the Associated Students of the University of Wyoming. I did want to bring to you guys the attention of Senate Resolution 3028, which is Senate Resolution 3028 in our body, which is a formal opposition to House Bill 160. I'll kind of go through the components as we go here, but for many out-of-state students, a YO1 ID card is their only form of identification issued from an institution of the state of Wyoming. And in my conversations with voters and conversations that we have other members of the body have had in our voter outreach efforts that we've conducted on campus, this is the only, they operate under the assumption that this is an acceptable form of ID, which currently is correct, but there's also substantive reason for this. The YO1 ID card is used, is given based off of personal information, so social security number, home addresses, and transcripts from other institutions in order to establish citizenship and residency status. That is something that we do as part of applying to go to the University of Wyoming. And before we are issued the W number, which is on the YO1 ID card, social security numbers are kind of the way we are entered into the system. That is our main form of identifier. And then they generate the W number for us, which then replaces it within the system. YO1 ID cards are used all over campus. It's proper identification to get into buildings, so I can swipe or in most cases now tap to get into buildings on campus. I can pay my tuition bill using the information on my YO1 ID card. And for a lot of us, it's also the way we get into our places of residence. So if we have on-campus housing, a YO1 ID card is what we use. With that being said, currently Wyoming is among 20 states that allow for student identification, for voter identification to be used through student ID cards from universities, community colleges, and any of their state's respective public schools. And that's 20 out of 37 that require any form of voter identification. On top of this, and discussions that we've had with students in terms of what this change would mean, there is a concern around voter education, voter outreach, a lot of confusion that would go around the given assumption that a UW-issued ID card would not be accepted at a Wyoming polling place. Members of the University of Wyoming are students here. They have residences, they have addresses. They, in a lot of cases, work for the university, so the state in a way is their employer. They live, work, and learn here in Wyoming. And a lot of them wish to exercise their right to vote here. Students have dual residency status, so they have their permanent address and then they have their address here in Wyoming. And students are allowed to use discretion as to which address they can use so long as they only vote at one address. Lots of students do choose to vote here in Wyoming and do use their YO1 ID card for verification. As long as it has your full name and a photo, which in my instance it does, it is able to be verified at polls. And so one of the things that we're worried about going forward is that if this change is made and not enough students are reached out in terms of this change being made, people are going to start going to the polls and they won't have an acceptable form of identification, or they don't believe that they have an acceptable form of identification, even if they might. That's the worry, is that there will be a lot of confusion, and ultimately it's not necessarily the the letter of the law that will turn every student away, but it is the confusion once you get there that will. And so going off of this, a couple of more things that UW and us as the associated students of the University of Wyoming have done to kind of increase voter efforts is we've done voter outreach and voter education events. We recently agreed to terms with the Albany County Clerk's Office to have a polling place on campus. It'll be in the Gateway Center starting 2026 and will run for the next 10 years. And on top of that, this is kind of going off of studies that show that students who live in closer proximity to voting centers will exercise their right to vote in person. And so one of the
Got a
most,
question here, Mr.
Quick
Brown.
question, why the Gateway Center? That's not exactly Central Campus.
it's not exactly central, or sorry, thank you, Chairman, thank you, Senator. It is not quite central campus, but it is the biggest facility we were going to get for the amount of traffic that we were anticipating. And basically, the rationale behind it is it's still within minutes walk of most people, whether you're on campus or in university apartments especially. So it is kind of the best we could get for the size and the location that was provided. Does that answer your question?
Mr. Chairman, yes, it does. It seems to me that the Union would be the place where you'd get your undergrads all to show up. I do understand the apartments, but everyone in the apartments drives, and so I'm a little surprised that that wasn't the target, was the Union.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Senator. I do believe, I wasn't part of the initial negotiations when this happened, so I don't know why the Gateway Center was the one we ended up on, but given where it is on campus and still its level of accessibility through both walking and also through campus busing. So campus busing has routes along that time, so if walking is a concern, those can be taken as well. That is kind of why we ended up with the contract with the Gateway Center.
Mr. Brown, I think maybe you phoned a friend.
She probably did.
I think,
Can you give us your name?
absolutely. Hi, my name is Sophia Gomelski. I'm the Director of Governmental Affairs for the Associated Students of the University of Wyoming. And so,
Give me that name again. I'm kind of slow.
no, that's fair. Sophia Gomelski.
Diego. Okay.
No, I think that my friends did a great job explaining why it's at the Gateway Center. It may not be the most ideal location for it, but due to some of the very strict voter ID laws and voting laws that we have in the state as is, that's kind of what leads us to have these restrictions and inconveniences that kind of restrict students' right and access to their democratic process and right to vote. But I do also have separate comments from all of them, so I'll leave it back to you.
I'll just say briefly also to address another point that was made, that the voter registration form, that sometimes we have the Albany County Clerk's Office on campus for voter outreach events. And so they will walk through kind of the whole process in terms of acceptable identification. I don't have the form pulled up for me exactly, but off the top of my head, I can remember it's Wyoming driver's license or identification, and if you don't have that, then social security number is the thing that is presented.
And Mr. Brown, how does the poll watcher know all that information when you give them your Y01 card? Do they have to research that somehow in the computer system, or how do they know all the information you say that's on there?
Hi again, yeah. So I've been a poll worker, and what we do when somebody hands us an ID is we do, cross-check it with the existing information, which would include their voter registration. And so when they hand us whatever card that it is, we're able to double-check that. And for the most part, that's delegated to the county clerk anyway. So they might be in the polling room with us. So they're going to be the ones checking for a large majority of the people that come in. And I'm going to be honest, those problems with false identifications haven't been a problem when I've served as a poll worker, so.
Okay, thank you. Other questions for Mr. Brown? Other questions for Sophia?
Maybe not questions, but I do have a little bit more to say, if that's okay.
Okay.
Yes, okay. I do think that my fellow students have done a pretty good job explaining why this bill is a bad idea. So I do just want to emphasize that Wyoming's small population provides us with a very unique access to our government, which is part of what I love most about this state. That's how we're able to come after our classes and come talk to you today. But at the same time, our state has one of the lowest voter turnouts in the entire country. And that's partly because of lack of interest and political efficacy, but also access to time and information. And this low participation rate only exacerbates the gap in youth political engagement in our state. So it's hard enough to convince students to do just about anything, I'd argue, but denying the validity of school-issued IDs sends a pretty mixed message about the value of civic engagement and participation in our democratic process. I think it kind of undermines the role of schools as institutions that should be creating good citizens, good engaged citizens and students. The Albany County Clerk's Office is within walking distance to the university, and so if students didn't drive there and they walked and they didn't bring their driver's license, they might still have their student ID on them. That would allow them to still exercise their constitutional right to vote. I did serve as a poll worker, as I mentioned, and this past election was my first time voting. That day, I insisted on going the day of in person. Might have been a mistake, but I stood in line outside in the freezing cold wearing a skirt for about 3 hours past the poll close time just to cast my vote. And that's because I love democracy and I love our right to vote. But if I had forgotten my driver's license at that point, I'm not sure that I would have even been able to go back for it and still exercise my right to vote. So the university student IDs from the university, the way that they are issued to us, we have to provide a government issued ID, so like a passport. So it's already a government agency, and you have to show that ID, like that would indicate that you are in fact a United States citizen. So we should be making it more accessible for students to vote and make their voices heard. And I think that this bill is kind of a step in the wrong direction. I did tell my voting and elections class about this bill before I left as well, and they genuinely thought I was kidding. Frankly, there's no good reason to pass this bill. It's trying to solve a non-existent problem while simultaneously disenfranchising young voters. Please don't send that message to the students in this state. Please vote no on this bill. Thank you. And I'm here for questions. yeah.
Sophia, this is for the University of Wyoming and the junior colleges. Are the junior college card Y01 or whatever they call it, are they the same as the University of Wyoming? Do they have all that background information?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. They, to the best of my knowledge, they do as well. You do have to provide a government-issued ID to receive an ID from a community college. It may not be the same for high school, but that seems to be a problem that's easily fixed by when the person goes to register to vote. Either they're not registered because they're too young to vote, or they're providing a high school ID, and then people find out that you are in fact too young to vote still. So the problem is mitigated pretty easily by our trusted and amazing county clerks.
Other questions for Sarah, or Sophia, excuse me. Sophia. Oh, you have a question for Sophia?
Oh, no. My apologies, Chair.
Okay.
There is one further addendum I forgot to leave out in my initial testimony. We did attach an addendum E of our resolution, data from the Heritage Foundation regarding convicted cases of voter fraud here in Wyoming. Between the years of 1982 and 2024, we've had 4 criminal convictions for voter fraud, none in which involved Y01 IDs or any form of student identification.
For cases where, in the US or in Wyoming?
In Wyoming.
Oh, in Wyoming. In how many years?
42 years.
Okay. All right. Other questions? Other questions? Any other questions? Hearing none, thank you for your testimony. Thank you for coming over and being with us and expending your time to do that. We really appreciate you being here. Very much. I don't think so. Oh, they do. Anyone else from the public like to testify? Oh, my goodness.
Oh, my goodness.
Oh, my goodness.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to have to leave
Okay, all right.
in a minute. Not quite yet, but I'll
Yeah.
leave that with you.
Mr. Chairman, my name is Mary Langford, and I have the honor of representing the county clerks of the state of Wyoming. And I'm going to apologize before we ever even start, because I am going to be the bearer of bad news here concerning student IDs. we, the clerks, have always contended that a photo ID is a photo ID, and a student has to verify a lot in order to get a student ID. And as you've heard, they have to provide documents to get their student ID. Help America Vote Act forms of ID for voter registration should also qualify for voter ID, county clerks have always believed, and that's reflected in our rules and our statutes. So that's where we are right now. We've always allowed voter ID to be, or student IDs to be a portion of voter ID. However, recently, with the coming of this particular bill, the clerks have done some recent research, and this research is within the last month within the state of Wyoming. And we've researched student IDs. We've contacted the University of Wyoming, Laramie County Community College, Central Wyoming College, Job Corps, and the Catholic College. What documents or combination of documents are required to get a student ID? A government-issued photo ID, such as a driver's license, a passport, state identification card, or a military ID, a birth certificate, or even your social security number. What we have found through all of this with student IDs currently, students are allowed to use nicknames, variations of their names, and not consistently across the colleges or high schools that issue IDs. A combination of a photo without a proper name is our concern. So you have a photo ID, but maybe it's got Big Bubba on it, or it's got some other sort of a nickname or a variation of a name, a nickname with a proper name. Proper names on photo IDs for voter ID, student IDs for voter, for student IDs for voter IDs is really an issue that we have proper names for those. And that's one of the concerns that the clerks have with this particular bill. And again, this is not something, we supported student IDs in 21 when voter ID became available. Student IDs, again, as I said, are available in conjunction with other documents for voter registration. So a couple of different things going on there. If this bill should happen to pass, the clerks have been committed, and our clerk that's in Albany County has committed also that we would go back to the colleges and say, hey, would you guys get some consistency on your student IDs so that they can be used by your students? Because we fully figured that they were okay and could be used for ID, for voter ID, but without them having proper names on them. And we don't have any way of knowing if it's got a barcode on it or whatever. Our judges are looking for a photo with a name. And if we need to have a little more identity on there to help, that helps also. But we're not looking for citizenship or residency or those kinds of things. We're looking just for ID. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would be happy to stand for questions if I can, and I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news.
We have a question. Go ahead, Senator Rothfuss.
Thanks. So did you directly survey the university and the colleges to get the information that they could use informal names? I mean, my ID says Christopher J. Rothfuss on it. University of Wyoming doesn't give you any flexibility over what you use.
It was some of the other colleges that we had, the junior colleges.
In Wyoming?
In Wyoming, yes.
The Wyoming community colleges
Yes.
give flexibility? Okay.
Yes, so, yeah, so with the other colleges that we polled was LCCC and Central Wyoming College. We've talked to, and that was a quick survey that we did, but we've got some issues with how those student IDs get issued.
Do concealed carry permits require that you use a professional name, that you use your,
Yeah, like your real name, yeah. They
the
do.
concealed carry permit does?
Mr. Chairman, yes.
And I assume Medicare and Medicaid cards would as well? So this is the only one?
Mr.
that-
Chairman, yes.
Okay, but those don't have a photo on them, as I understand it. Do either of those have a photo, Medicaid or Medicare?
No, Medicare, Medicaid do not. Currently, there is a bill in process to remove those since they aren't photo IDs. However, as it currently stands, they are good for a sunset of 2029.
Yeah, 29 is what's.
Yeah.
Okay. And to be clear, I think, Mr. Chairman, it was said both ways, but the decision over what is eligible for registration is currently, by rule of the Secretary of State, as adequate proof for identity. So the list that we're talking about is only for identification at the polling place if you've already been registered. Is that accurate?
Mr. Chairman, yes, that's correct. So the list of things that you can use for registration, as you said, are by rule, and those comply with HAVA, which is the Help America Vote Act of 2020, or 2000, sorry. And then voter ID is actually in the statute.
And for that, my apologies, one more question. I think you said that university IDs were actually allowed under HAVA. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's correct.
So if we restricted, then ironically, if we passed 160, you would be allowed to register with this, but you wouldn't be allowed to vote with it. Is that accurate?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, yes, that's correct.
Thank you.
Senator Cooper, you have a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Langford, so if Robert John Gump showed up with his ID that said Bubba, but he had to register as Robert, or whatever his formal name is, would he be allowed to vote? Or would that, in my opinion, currently, would that be a adequate identification?
Currently, they accept student IDs. And Mr. Chairman, Senator Cooper, so there would probably be a decision on the judge's part to say, yeah, I think Bubba Gump is okay. But that's a concern because they really should be matching what we have in our voter registration list.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, go ahead.
follow up. When I go to vote and I give them my card, Ms. Langford, they look on the voter registration list and make sure that my card matches the list. If Bubba is not Robert, it's not the same person. Wouldn't that be correct?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cooper, that's correct.
Senator Jones.
Mr. Chairman, so if you used your student ID to register and it says Big Bubba on there, then is that how your name would be listed as Big Bubba? So then if they went to vote, even though that's not their legal name, but they registered under that name, am I thinking of this wrong?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Jones, they wouldn't be allowed to use, they've got to use their proper name because they've got to go through the different screening. So there's a system called WildReg, which is the voter registration system. And it also, if they registered with a student ID, they probably would also be asked for some support documents, their driver's license number, for instance, because that goes into WildReg where they're able to check for citizenship and residency and vital records and those kinds of things. Yeah.
Any other questions for Langford?
Yep.
Anyone else?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry this is really confusing.
Yes, it is.
It's very confusing.
Yes, it is.
Good afternoon, Chairman. Gail Simmons from Sheridan County. I'm with Civics 307 and YVote. YVote has a mission of all eligible Wyoming citizens being informed voters in each election. We only have 50% of our eligible citizens who are currently registered to vote. This last August, we only had 53% of our registered voters who actually participated, and in November, it was 91%. A few years ago, AARP, Mr. Chairman, had a study that was done that had participation in our processes broken down by age groups. And while overall we were at 50%, in the 18 to 30-year-old group, I believe it was somewhere around 15%. So the people whose future the decisions that are being made here and by other elected officials, those are the individuals whose futures are being most impacted, and yet they are the least amount being actually showing up and voting. Of the 45 bills that had been put in place to be considered, of those 45, about 2 of them were bills that were positive actions to encourage participation through registration, participation, and other ways in which it makes it easier, just as rigorous, but more easier for individuals to vote. I believe that this is not, the way it's currently written, Mr. Chairman, this is not addressing a real issue, which, as Mary Langford identified, is that those IDs should be consistent. So rather than removing where the majority of them, because there's more students at the University of Wyoming than there, I believe, than there are combined at all the rest, rather than removing a capability, I would say vote down this bill and have a conversation. I'd be happy to work with the community colleges in order for them to put into place a consistent identification that meets the criteria that would allow that to be appropriately used for voting. So I urge you to vote down this bill. We have not had any problems that have been reported officially with use of these student IDs. And so we're removing a capability. And then just one final thing, Mr. Chairman, is again to remind that this is for identification of the person for voting. It is not for registration. That is a very rigorous process that has to go through the clerks, who do a fantastic job. And so this is solely used to say, yes, this is the person who's been given a ballot, who is the person who is registered on that account. So again, let's solve the real issue, which in this case is simply to work through and make sure that there's consistency and use of proper name on all student IDs. And I stand for questions.
Any questions for Ms. Simons? Thank you. Ms. Simons, thank you for being here. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We don't have a quorum, but I'm going to go ahead and take testimony. And we just won't vote on this bill because we don't have a quorum. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, member of committee as well. My name is Marissa Carpia. I'm with the Equality State Policy Center. We've been around for 30 years, ensuring fair elections and transparent government in Wyoming. Just going to echo a lot of Ms. Simmons' points from before. In 2022, that AARP study she's talking about, only 13% of 18 to 24-year-olds voted in that election. Earlier in the day, I sat and listened in the Senate Corporations Committee about requiring 25% participation of the electorate to vote in bond elections for them to go through. And we're not even close to meeting that for young voter participation. If students are saying that this bill will make it harder to vote and will send a mixed message, I think we should listen to their concerns. And I would echo that perhaps this is a part of a larger conversation on the conformity and the consistency of the documents needed for IDs across the state. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. Any questions? Question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Corporal, when I saw this bill coming up, I questioned my homegrown, what would you call them?
Students?
Yeah, but lobbyist, if you will.
Oh.
Okay, my 2 grandsons. And I asked very clearly, when you're on campus, do you carry your driver's license? And the answer was very clear from both of them, no, because I don't drive. I walk or I ride my bicycle anywhere I go, so I don't carry my wallet with me. Do you think this would bring an impediment to these young people on campus voting?
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Cooper, I do. I was one of those privileged students that had a driver's license when I was in college, and I got to drive many people around that did not have those licenses. And I do know that those folks would be disenfranchised since they use their student ID for everything.
You're discussing the turnout on the primary, and do you have any idea what the turnout is for the university they were talking about? Just for the registered voters, is there any statistics on that? Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. I'm not sure. I know there's a recent poll that came out of the University of Wyoming, but I don't think it was actually a breakdown of who voted. I could be wrong. And if I find that when I sit down, I'll be sure to send it to you all.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions for Martha? Hearing none, thank you, Martha. Thank you. Any other public comment for House Bill 160? Oh, right here, yes, yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman Anderson. Kathy Russell with the Wyoming Republican Party. I'm the executive director. Again, this bill and election integrity issues are a primary issue, one of the top three for Wyoming Republicans. We stand in support of this bill for some of the reasons that have been brought up, particularly Mary Langford's identification of problems with consistency in using birth certificate names. We actually have in the office an example of that, a couple called whose nephew was living with them during the pandemic, and he received 3 applications for an absentee ballot because his name was different or his address was different on each of the 3. They were unique. The reason was because he was a student, he had a permanent residence in Montana, and he was a student at UW. And so looking up some of the issues with the student ID, it is my understanding, and this would need to be verified, that the student ID does not show permanent residence. In other discussions on election integrity and identification of permanent residence, the guidance that we have been given or advised is that permanent residence is the place you intend to return to. As a student, by definition, you are not going to be permanently residing at the address on the student resident, the student ID, because the residence listed is your residence while you are on campus. Additionally, the standards of proof on HAVA say that it is standards of proof for residency or identity. And so the issue for us here is residency, because we don't want to disenfranchise our folks who are permanent residents of the state of Wyoming by allowing the potential for double voting in a place of residence and a place of temporary residence as a student. So we stand in support of this bill. Thank you.
Questions? Senator Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maybe I'm completely misinterpreting again, but I don't think so. This is not for registration. This is just for the polling. Is that correct? Just for the polling place. So it has nothing to do with the residency. That's all proven when they register to vote. This is just when they show up at the polling place and say, "This is me." Is that correct? Is that how you understand this bill?
If you're showing, Mr. Chairman, if you're coming to a polling place, the intent is to vote. And so I believe the issue is, does the student ID address the issue of being a permanent resident of that district and precinct?
Mr. Chairman.
That's my understanding.
Question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I understand it, what it says is, this is who I am. You have to provide that permanent residency when you register to vote, not when you show up at the poll and say, this is my picture, this is who I am, and they check it to the registration list. If you're not registered, you can't vote.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
As long as the student ID is not used as the document for residency, it would provide identity if the issue that was identified by Mary Langford was addressed. That alone is reason to pass this bill to give us time to correct that issue.
Question?
No, I'm done.
Question? No more questions? Thank you, Ms. Russell. Thank you for being with us. You're next.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Committee, Joey Carenti, Rural Wyoming Matters. Been intimately involved with Wyoming elections for quite a few years. I've been on the county canvassing board in my county for the last 3 elections. I don't know if it needs to be said to the committee, but just to clarify for people out there in YouTube land, there is a difference between proving you are the person that can vote and lives where you live, which is the registration process, and proving that you're the person that's already registered. I believe that's what we're talking about today. So with that, the concern that I think might be getting conflated is same-day registrations of transient or student populations. This bill doesn't contemplate that in detail. This bill doesn't talk about making all of those automatically, what do you call it? Ballots you're not going to count that day. You hold on to the next day to make sure. I get that concern. On this, my concern is the bill's a good bill. I think it's necessary, especially in conjunction with other bills that look like they're going to pass this year. I don't know if the immediate effective date is necessary because we don't necessarily have an election coming up, but there is a current statute, Title 31-8-104, that every applicant for an identification card in the state of Wyoming shall pay $10 to the department plus an additional $10 for a digital identification card if applicable. This fee shall be waived if the applicant requests identification card that shall be used only for voter identification purposes. So the access, the availability, and the cost is already out the window. The only problem is right now, although YDOT does do mobile services to the small rural areas, and they do link up with the care facilities, whether they're medical or retirement care facilities, they're changing their system right now. So it does not link with their mobile systems, and they cannot issue those free ID cards for voting mobily. So I think the bill has merit, especially in conjunction with other bills that are about to pass. I think the state is already in a position where we can provide free IDs specifically for this purpose and have them applied for and delivered mobily by YDOT. I just don't know that they can do it right now because of the system change they're going through to address other issues we have with addresses on Wyoming IDs for voting purposes. So I sit on the county canvassing board. I review all of the manual poll books. Anecdotally, 95% of the IDs used are a Wyoming driver's license, a Wyoming ID card, or people like me that like to be snarky and just use our concealed carry permit because we're allowed to. I don't see a huge problem unless people are already not voting because all of the types of IDs we have available are not being used, whether it be absentee to get the actual absentee ballot or at the polling location. It's a super majority of the votes being cast. So I don't see this as problematic right off the bat, but the effective date may need to be considered if we talk with YDOT and find out how long it's going to take for them to start doing their mobile registration and delivery of those ID cards once their system is up and running. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll stand for any questions.
That is a different problem or a different bill, but for your canvassing board, do you have any student IDs that are being used?
Mr. Chairman, I haven't seen any, not even from other states, thank God, because that would raise my alarm. But we also don't have a university. We don't have a community college. We have a higher education center. But I do know, looking over into the county to the east of us and then up to the northwest a little bit, they do have a high number of same-day registrants of a transient or student population that all share the same address, the dorms, the living, which I could see being concerning, even if it doesn't come to fruition as a problem with this bill. Why not take the naysayers wind right out of their sails and say, okay, well, fine, we're going to do it, but we're going to make sure everybody who wants to vote and wants to have an ID can get one, and we have most of that available in statute now.
Other questions for Mr. Corianti? Other questions? Thank you, Mr. Corianti. Thanks for being with us today. Now, finally, Secretary of State is going to talk to us. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
It's always a pleasure.
Thank you for
I miss
being
you. I
with
don't
us.
see you as much anymore.
No.
All right. Well, I'm Chuck Gray, the Wyoming Secretary of State, and to my right is Joe Rubino, our policy director and also our general counsel. Great to be in Senate Minerals. Love the Minerals Committee. Unique committee for this bill, but I know there's been a lot of workload issues, and so really appreciate you hearing this bill. I want to start out our presentation by laying out the last 4 years. So 4 years ago, we passed in the 21 general session, 22 session, we passed voter ID, which was a bill that's near and dear to my heart, worked a lot on it as a lead, and there were some things that came on at the end that were compromises that were made and floor amendments that were made on what would be on the list of acceptable identification. And we wanted to get this on the books, but I think there was always an understanding that maybe we start out a little bit more, I think the bodies both said that maybe we start out with leaning on more IDs, and as you went on and the public began to really understand this requirement, we got the word out there about this requirement, a few elections passed, that we'd move towards a stricter form of voter ID. And that's what we're trying to do on this bill and on House Bill 206. This bill removes student ID from the list of acceptable identifications for voter ID purposes. And a key priority of our administration has been to strengthen voter ID. And I want to stand in explicit support of the bill, which I think will add strength and uniformity to the security of credentials accepted in terms of identification to vote. First, I want to bring in some of our discussions with WYDOT Driver Services concerning driver's licenses issued by WYDOT and from other states, and the security features on those credentials as opposed to these. Credentials issued by WYDOT to temporary residents, i.e. non-citizens that are legally present, contains an NR designation, enabling election judges and staff to identify appropriate credentials ineligible for voting. And with Senate File 33, this will be even more explicit. Student ID cards, by contrast, may be issued to non-citizens attending the institutions of higher learning or a Wyoming public school in our state. But to my knowledge, they are not required by law to contain any indication, which is a needed safeguard for preventing non-citizens from voting in Wyoming. There are also concerns when comparing student ID cards to other credentials, such as a government-issued driver's license, which contain many security features that are not present in student ID cards. Unlike other forms of identification for voting, such as a Wyoming driver's license, a Wyoming ID card, a passport, a student ID does not have many of the advanced security features found in these other government-issued IDs, making them more susceptible to tampering and counterfeiting. A WYO1 ID card issued by the University of Wyoming, for example, does not indicate any expiration of the card, a date of birth, or many of the watermarks which avoid counterfeiting attempts. And of course, foreign nationals all the time are students there, and to our knowledge, there's no designation when one of those cards is issued to a foreign national, and really no procedure to identify that. There's also an overall disparity in the uniformity of student identification on this point. As the County Clerks Association of Wyoming testified, there is no uniformity across educational institutions in the administration, including the ability for some to place nicknames on the credential, nor is there any provisional law that requires them to do so. The other day, or a few months ago, I was going through some old stuff, and this will date me a little bit. I found my whole old high school ID from 20 years ago. And while I've aged a little bit, under the current statute, that would be allowed for voter ID for me to use under current law.
Mr. Secretary, I think we heard testimony that this ID was just used for voting. It was not used for registration, that they had to go through the registration, which is a lot more, like you say, has the Social Security and their address and all kinds of things on it, but it would not be on this ID, because this ID they're just using for voting. They're not using it for registration. And if they're not registered, then their university ID would not let them vote.
Well, Mr. Chairman.
That's what we heard.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. And yes, there are two parts, and it's very important we separate these two boxes. We have the registration process and voter ID, but you need security in both. Now, under our current registration process, we want there to be three buckets to that. Proof of identity, proof of residency, and proof of citizenship. Right now, under our rules, we only have one, which is proof of identity. We do not have proof of citizenship or proof of residency. That makes us vulnerable in certain ways. But also on the voter ID box, you have to match that person who is registered, assuming that process has been done correctly, you have to match that that person is who they say they are. And when you have an ID on the list that isn't quite there from a security perspective, that presents a vulnerability.
Got a question here.
Yes.
Go ahead, Senator Cooper.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary, I'm going to go back, I'm going to get a unique idea on this. Let's go back to the bill. Does this bill anywhere address voter registration?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Again, this is about voter ID, which you have to have security on voter ID. And what we're trying to do is remove an ID. And the county clerks and I, this is very rare when we're in agreement, total agreement on a bill. We're in total agreement on this, and I know they testified earlier. I was in another committee. But yes, this is for purposes of voter ID. But you need security there as well.
Okay, but this does not in any way address voter registration. And I think that's the big question. We keep going back to voter registration. That's not what this bill addresses.
Well, Mr. Chairman, as I talked about earlier, it's two different boxes. We haven't gotten there to where we want to be on registration, but you also need security on voter ID. And the student ID does not have the security features that you have on other identifications on the voter ID list.
Representative Tarver, you've got something to add to this.
Mr. Chairman, I want to go over something with Mr. Senator Cooper. So Senator Cooper, let's say I'm going to University of UW, and I really like the name Ed Cooper. So I'm going to have that put on my student ID. Maybe it's not the University of Wyoming, maybe it's a sub school. And then let's say I'm driving through Worland and I feel like voting. And then my ID says Ed Cooper, it's got my face on it. There's a registered voter, I'll bet, in Worland with that same name. I think that's what this loophole is this bill is trying to correct. We got to have uniformity in our IDs. And I think it's that particular reason we need this.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, go ahead.
Representative Tarver, if I showed up with an ID that said Ed Cooper and I'm registered as Edward Cooper, which is how I would have to register, I won't vote. They will not allow me to vote.
Mr. Chairman, then, for example, it's Edward Cooper then, because I don't believe when they're looking at the IDs, I don't think they have a photo ID of the registration also. That's the biggest problem I think here is there's a area there for, to cheat big time because they don't have the same scrutiny on the university IDs as they do a Wyoming issued ID. And there's definitely room there for fraud.
Mr. Secretary, you have some more for us?
Well, thanks. Do you have anything you want to add on that? No. Okay. The TSA accepts various forms of identification, including state-issued driver's licenses, U.S. passports, and more, but they do not accept student IDs, highlighting the insufficiency in meeting federal security standards. Mr. Chairman, I just think that the county clerks and I were in alignment on this. It's time for us to button up the list of what is allowed for voter ID purposes, and the student ID just doesn't get there. And so we're in support of this bill and really urge you to pass House Bill 160.
Questions? No more questions, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for being with us. Anyone else like to talk on House Bill 160? House Bill 160. We don't have anybody on Zoom. Okay, well, we're going to close public comment, but we can't vote on this bill because we don't have a quorum. So we'll carry this over to Wednesday, Sue, and maybe we'll have a quorum on Wednesday. We can vote on this. So with that.
Mr. Chairman, I do have a comment.
Yeah, sure.
I just wanted to thank the folks from the university, the students that came over. I appreciate your participation. I don't agree fully with everything you say, but I don't disagree with a lot of what you say too. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank everyone for being here. And with that, we'll close the Senate Minerals Committee meeting and